So before we again talk about distributed denial of service or DDoS, let's just kind of back up and talk about what is like a standard DOS attack or DOS attack. So a standard denial of service attack is, think of it as, you know, an attacker is essentially trying to overwhelm a service to prevent other people from being able to use that service. I like to use, I don't know what the kind of age group in here of everyone, but anyone probably over 35, 40 probably remembers, even maybe younger, remembers like landlines, right? Before cell phones were really popular, you had like one phone in your home. And in the early days, there wasn't like a call waiting or anything. It was literally just like one line. So if someone was talking and you called, there'd be a busy signal. So if you really wanted to kind of be mean, you could just keep calling that person over and over again, and basically it wouldn't allow someone else to call. So I'm going to use a few analogies kind of like that, but think of that just like essentially it's a single attacker trying to do something to a service, overwhelm it in some way so that it's not available for others to use. And so think of it as like a 1-to-1 ratio is kind of the way I like to think of it. So we have a single attacker, we have a single service. Service could be very general, very broad. For our talks, we're focused mainly on like web applications, but it could be a lot of different things. Obviously, again, going back to the phone analogy, or like, you know, you have a friend you were kind of wanting to play a prank on, you could just keep calling them over and over again, not allowing other people to call them, or just stay on the line with them for a really long time, and no one else will be able to get through. So we have a single attacker, a single source of the target, if you will. There are many different methods. We'll go over a few of how we may flood, if you will, or overwhelm a particular service that essentially brings it down. So in DOS world or DDoS world, a lot of times we'll use the phrase tango down for an application. So if you're on Twitter and you happen to see hashtag tango down, I don't want to say that we coined that term, but it's used very, very heavily in anonymous world or hacker world to reference a target of any type being down, or of any type of action being down. So this just happens to be associated with a denial of service attack. So if you see someone flashing hashtag tango down, it could mean that they brought something down, or they're just sharing the info that they might be aware of something having been brought down. So that's a very, very common phrase or hashtag, if you will. So again, we have a 1-to-1 ratio. This is just denial of service, not distributed, which we'll get into later. So single attacker, single target. The goal is to bring it down in the sense that, yes, you could literally bring it down so that it's unavailable to everyone, or that you're just causing so much of a ruckus on that one service that no one else is able to use that service. And again, with the website, we're generally talking, think of the website being so busy that no one else can get to it anymore. The page cannot be displayed, the site can't be reached, whatever. Tools of the trade, a very, very, very common tool back in the day, and probably still is, was LOIC, or low orbit ion cannon. This was generally originally meant to be a stress test, which still can be used as one by a company called Pratox. And this, essentially, they released it. I'm not sure if it was released or if someone got the blueprints, if you will, to it, and then released it to the public. But essentially, this became a very, very favorited tool by many people to perform these types of attacks of a denial of service attack. Or if multiple people are using this tool, you could then essentially have a distributed denial of service attack, which we'll get into. But again, we're just talking about just plain old denial of service. So one man, one person, one woman, one attacker trying to bring down a target. This could be a tool they used. Again, there's different methods of attacks. This happens to be able to leverage TCP or UDP packets, and essentially just sending many, many, many packets to a service or port, and essentially just trying to overwhelm it, so much so that it can't answer the other quote unquote calls or requests from another source. And most notable, I think this tool became very, very popular or public once Anonymous launched their OpChan against Scientology. So again, there was many different types of attacks, but essentially it was kind of a protest. And we would argue that in today's modern world, the old protests or old sit-ins, as you would call them, you would literally go to a physical location and block the door or block an entrance, lock arms, don't let anybody in. And that was your way of kind of protesting whatever belief you had against, said company. But with the digital age, or the fact that, say I wanted to protest in some other country, but I don't want to fly over there to stand in front of some building, some argued that you could essentially have an online voice to do that. And so that was some people's thought of, I could just, use a tool or help in a denial of service attack or distributed denial of service attack. And that's my digital way of standing in front of the door. But there's kind of a little bit of a flaw in the logic, because in the real world, you're only one person. In the digital world, you could be essentially billions of packets, if you will, or people. So, I mean, I get it. It kind of makes sense a little bit in the idea of, this is my way of sort of protesting. But without getting, too far into this, anyone can kind of go up there and do some research on this op or project that Anonymous was part of. And so that's, again, a very, very high overview of just denial of service. Again, it's one attacker, one target. There's many, many methods, which we'll go over, but just think of it as just like that. Very, very, I don't want to say like a lack of impact, but you're kind of, it's a lone attack. It's just you and the target and whatever method you have of doing that attack. Again, going back to the old school days of just a landline and you just call over and over again, or let's just say for some way or shape or form, you found an application that was very weak or on very, very limited borrowed resources, and it wouldn't take much to tip it over. And if you could simulate heavy traffic or heavy volume of types of requests, then you could essentially clog it up, if you will. Think of it as like a freeway, and a freeway is moving or flowing freely, and now you have an on-ramp that's just injecting thousands and thousands and thousands of cars. That's going to interrupt the general flow, of traffic. So now we'll move on to kind of a higher review of what is a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS or DDoS. And so going back to DOS, just think of, or denial of service, just think of that, but done by multiple people or multiple systems that are then able to perform the attack. So if, say, you're attacking a target by yourself, that's a single attack, denial of service. Now I think you and your buddy, and your buddy is at a different location. Now we all of a sudden have a distributed denial of service. Granted, a very weak one or a very small one, but nonetheless, it's distributed now. Traffic is coming from two different locations or multiple locations against the same target. So think of that for this. We'll get into some of the various methods of how we can do distributed, and then what those methods are. So on the right-hand side here, we see a few methods. Again, these methods are, think of them as like, they can be cross-used. So you can do a denial of service attack using this HTTP flood or SYN flood or amplification. So the attack itself is kind of independent. It's really how many people or entities, bots or machines are performing the attack is what makes it distributed. So for an HTTP flood attack, think of that as an attack against layer 7, the application, the website, if you will. Again, we're going to kind of focus more on the website of things, but it's a much larger scope. But think of this type of attack, this HTTP flood attack, as like a user pressing the refresh button over and over and over again, or visiting the site over and over and over and over again. It's essentially making a HTTP request, if you will. So when you go to the URL and you type in or to go to the browser and type in the URL and hit enter, the browser goes and grabs that, asks that from the server delivers it, and it's brought back to you. So that's, the server is performing a function, a task. So every time you hit refresh, and we're gonna set aside a few real world things of caching, CDNs, things like that, which we'll talk about later. But for now, just to keep it very simple, just think of a user is getting direct access to the application. And when that user calls that URL or hits the page refresh, the server is resending the information. So for this attack, just think of, again, it's like hitting the refresh button over and over and over. But for this particular instance, we are talking about distributed. So let's think of now as multiple people hitting the refresh button in a malicious sort of intent. Obviously, every day websites are getting thousands of visitors in traffic, but those aren't necessarily meant maliciously. But in our instance, we are intently trying to have some adverse effect on that system. And again, we're talking about distributed denial of service right now. So as the HTTP flood attack goes, think of an attacker having control over some bots, which we'll get to, or just think of these as just individual systems in different locations, and they're all sending a request to just like normal traffic, except for we're sending a much larger flood of traffic, or much larger, many more types of requests. Not your average just one click and browse the page. We're talking hundreds of thousands, per minute types of requests. And again, if we're talking distributed, all of these systems are sort of are doing that. So again, we're trying to overwhelm our target so much so that the target can no longer respond to other requests. And in this demonstration, or this topic, we're focusing more on the web application side of things, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not just related to web applications, but that's just kind of what we're going to focus on. So this is the HTTP flood. Again, think of it through a browser of some sort, and you're just hitting the page over and over and over again, and you're trying to do it so many times that the server can't answer other people's requests. So that's kind of the HTTP flood. We move on to a SYN flood. So common theme here, flood, that typically means a whole lot of whatever it is. This is happening at the layer 3 and 4, so think TCP, TCP/IP, and this is going to kind of try and leverage anyone taking their N+, the three-way handshake, right? So we have like a SYN, we have the SYNAC, and then the ACK, right? So what we're trying to do is we're going to essentially, actually, let me go back. There's a cool little analogy. Think of it as a worker in a supply room that receives a request from the front of the store. Now the worker goes to the back of the store and gets a package. But before he comes out to the front, he's going to wait and say, hey, are we sure that this is the right package? Or are we sure this is what you want before I bring it out? And while he's waiting, more requests come in to go grab more things. So he's running around the back of the store, grabbing all these things, still waiting to hear confirmation for all those orders. So that's kind of like an analogy of the SYN flood leveraging that sort of TCP/IP handshake. So think of it like, if, again, back to the old phone analogy, that I call you, and again, there's like no call waiting or whatever. I call you and you pick up, but I don't say anything. So you're there going, hello, the line's still open, and I haven't hung up, so I'm leaving that connection kind of open, but I just don't reply back. So you just kind of sit there like, who's on the other line, kind of waiting. Now let's say you do have call waiting and you hear someone beep in. So I haven't closed the connection. You click over thinking that, it's someone else calling, and you say, hey, hello, and then there's nobody there. And before you can hang up or go back to the first call, another one comes in. And this keeps happening over and over. So essentially what we're doing is we're sending these packets, but we're not responding to the SYNAC, if you will. So we're leaving these kind of connections open. And so we're trying to use up resources in this type of attack. So instead of asking the server to bring us a page over and over again, we're basically saying that we're going to open up a connection, and we're going to try and leave it open for as long as we can before it closes. And we're going to try and open up as many of these as we possibly can. Obviously, you could kind of look at this as like a denial of service, because there's only like one kind of point of entry or attack, if you will. But you can also think of this as being distributed. Again, all of these attacks can be performed via just a single denial of service or distributed. The attack isn't necessarily what makes it, or the type of attack doesn't necessarily make it distributed or not. It's really how many sources is the attack coming from that kind of separates it from being distributed and versus not. So this is what a SYN kind of flood looks like. Moving on, we'll talk about an amplification attack, which has been in the news a few times. And this is, some people will argue that it is or isn't distributed. I kind of look at it as like a hybrid, where you're still gonna, you could do either or. You can still leverage multiple bots or zombies, or which we'll talk about, or machines to perform this attack. And again, another analogy is very similar to like the SYN flood. Is essentially you're going to call a restaurant and say, I'll have one of everything, please, but call me back and reconfirm my order. But the callback number is the targeted number. So it would be kind of like I spoof my target's IP address and I make a request to a server. In this case, we'll talk about like DNS amplification. And that DNS, so that's the initial request is very small. I'm just saying I'll have one of everything. I don't even know what everything is. I haven't even looked at the menu. There could be 1,000 items on the menu. I don't know. I'm saying I'll have one of everything. That's a very small request. And I'm spoofing myself as the target. So what the server is going to do is going to reply back to that address and then give a list of everything that's on the menu, because that's what we asked it to do. So this is why we're calling it an amplification attack, because very little in, a whole lot out. And very little could be literally bytes. But when that gets amplified, that exponentially can increase traffic or flow to that target very, very quickly, and then slowly build up. So this is a very, very powerful attack. But again, going back to the analogy, just think of a very short request gets a very long reply, and again, we're spoofing the target, and that's how we're able to get that information to send back to the target, because we're spoofing our target's address. So the servers believe that that's where the request came from. Just like, again, if I spoof my phone number to my friend's phone number, call a restaurant, say I'll have one of everything, please call me back at this number, and I give my friend's number and tell me and just confirm my order, my friend is going to get that phone call, not me. And then they're going to hear someone rambling about all the stuff that they had just ordered. So that's kind of, think of like that as a crude way of putting an amplification attack. There's some notable attacks that were done like this. One of the more famous one was the Memcache against GitHub in 2018. Some of us may remember. I definitely remember that. And it was at the time, I think the largest type of amplification attack that has ever existed. It might still hold the record. So we're talking about unheard of amounts of packets, terabytes per second. I mean, again, up until this, there was like no attack that even came close to the amount of bandwidth that was sent. We'll talk about another one actually that did come close, but I think this might kind of hold the record. Again, this is an amplification type attack, not your typical bot attack that we all maybe think of when we think of distributed denial of service. Mostly we think of bots and stuff, which we'll get to. And so again, this is kind of what the amplification attack looks like. We're going to spoof our attacker's address, send a very small request to say like a DNS server or something, and then they're going to answer back in a amplified sort of way. Again, we can leverage one instance to do this, so that's why some people might think of it as like a hybrid, because you might essentially be contacting this, and then we're getting this kind of output. Some people refer to it as kind of like a hybrid, but this is kind of, think of it, kind of it looks like this. Some people, you could refer these to as bots. Some people will argue differently because of how they haven't been necessarily taken over, which we'll get to. So yeah, so that's amplification attack. Most notably in the distributed land of denial of service attacks, few come to mind, but this is probably one that made the books for sure, and made the press. I actually remember this attack. I actually remember having services being kind of degraded during this time. So there was actually it's still out there, I believe, but there was a malware, we call it a malware bot, back in 2016, although I'm sure it's much older than that. I think it was first discovered around then. And think of this as a malware that infects IoT devices. And once it infects one of those devices, it either then tries to infect other devices, or just performs the task at which was infected. So, some of these attacks can be, maybe we're infecting devices for spam, for ransomware, for things like that. But nonetheless, it kind of usually comes from some sort of malware worm of some sort, or virus, and it tries to propagate. again, one of the more famous attacks that this bot was recognized for was the 2016 attack against Dyn. There's a history there, but I think just to keep things kind of moving, think of them as like a DNS provider of sorts. So when they were attacked by, again, the largest attack at the time, that actually caused a chain reaction that caused issues with other services. And so these guys down here, Twitter, GitHub, Reddit, Netflix, they were using some way, shape, or form a service from Dyn. So when Dyn was attacked, it affected these other applications, and there's hundreds. These are just more of the like well-known ones. It essentially affected like part of the actual internet as a whole in the United States and in Europe. So that's probably in the scheme of actual distributed denial of service using bots, probably the largest, I think, maybe to date. It holds the record for that. Again, the GitHub attack was a little different. That was kind of using a vulnerability at the server level. It was using a caching vulnerability, and that's how the amplification was happening. This Dyn attack is literally leveraging hundreds of thousands of actual infected IoT devices that had this malware. And in doing so, it's kind of like let's attack the supply chain, right? So if I'm attacking something that other people are using, I'm effectively also including them in my scope. So kind of a win-win. I don't know if that was the target or not, was to get to some of these, or if that was just a bonus for them, or if they were just simply that's actually after Dyn. I tend to think it was intentional, that they were trying to inadvertently affect these other ones, but because of maybe the security guards in place that these had, it would be a little bit more difficult to attack them. Plus, now you'd have to attack these all individually, versus this is like, oh, let's attack something that they're all using, or some service that they're all using, and that will essentially trickles down and could affect them. So I tend to think that it was an intentional, not that they were just after this specific company. I had even never heard of them, so I don't think it was like some protest. It could have been, I don't know really, but it's odd that some of these large applications were affected. And this is kind of convoluted looking, but this is essentially one way to think of how these types of attacks go, or specifically how this malware bot was. So we have our bot master here, and that's just a common term for someone that controls command and control, or CNC or C2 is a common term for the device that controls what the botnet does, or what a bot does. And again, we'll talk about bots in a second, but just think of them as infected devices. But the way this works is we have kind of a little bit of a self-contained circle here. We have a server that's trying to distribute the malware, and then once it just constantly scours the internet looking for IoT devices that are publicly facing, internally facing, that have default creds that it can log into, and then start uploading and manipulating those services. And then now that is part of the bot, or it's part of our zombie farm, or army, whatever you want to refer to them as. And then now we just have our botnet just growing and growing and growing of our army of devices that are essentially now in our control. And then at that point, we can just point it at a target and say go, and whatever type of attack we're doing, or however the malware is configured for that attack, is what's going to happen. So now, again, we're leveraging tens, hundreds of thousands of devices that are now at our disposal to send some type of attack or a request or whatever it is. So again, instead of just a single attacker, a single target, now we have, think of them as hundreds of thousands of attackers against a single target. And again, we're just talking like in the web space. So think of all of them attacking a website. It's going to be very difficult for the average user to get to that website. Again, Twitter was down on a previous attack. GitHub was down because those services were being so exhausted or hit at the supply chain that they couldn't work correctly as they were intended to work, for the use they were intended to work, because they were, let's just say, so busy fulfilling other requests that they couldn't get to ours. So that's what this attack looks like. Again, this was from a worm, or this was from malware, and it's affecting all these IoT devices. And so that's basically like the high overview of what distributed attack looks like, what a distributed denial of service attack looks like. Some of the tools, in this case, it was, some bots, or you could leverage amplification attacks. But that's essentially some of the tools and most notable attacks. Again, they one against GitHub, one against Dyn, using a distributed denial of service. So we've mentioned bots over and over and over again. For those that don't know, bots are referred to like a group of devices. You could think of them as computers, websites, whatever it is, that are under control one way or the other of an attacker. An attacker has some way to manipulate that device to do its bidding. So a bot would be a single device. I could make my Raspberry Pi a bot, or a single computer a bot. But the minute I start having multiple bots, I now have a botnet, a network of bots. And you can see here kind of coming from the word robot. Some people refer to them as zombies. Some people refer to them as armies. And some people, the majority will refer to them as a botnet. And a botnet is, again, it's very, very broad scope. There's lots of uses, and that term is kind of thrown around a lot. But in this particular instance, for a distributed denial of service attack, we're thinking of devices, whether they're actual computers or an IoT device, which you could argue is kind of a computer. Think of it as like a standard workstation or a server, an IoT device, a camera, anything that essentially has some type of operating system. And if vulnerable to a certain extent, could be infected by a malware that takes that over, or just a single user that can log in and have it do something. Again, you have bots at your disposal you're probably not even aware of. And we'll also get to that. But here's kind of what the topography of what it might look like. We have our CNC, remember, our command and control, or our C2. This is where our attacker would log into, if you will, or have access to. Think of it as like a central hub that then controls all of these other bots. It could be as simple or as sophisticated as you can dream, to communicate to the bots and then send commands. A very, very, very popular platform to control bots was IRC. It still is. But over the years, it's become a little bit more sophisticated than that. But again, just think of it as like a central hub that you can access, that then gives you command over all of your army, if you will, or your zombies, or your bots. So this is what we call a star topology. Kind of looks like a star. There's a center and then all the little arms. But another common one is kind of think of like a pyramid or like a tree, things like that, where we have some sort of central controller that then branches out. And other bots can talk to other bots and relay commands that way, so that the CNC isn't necessarily connected to millions. It can just be connected to a few. Those are connected to a few, kind of like a pyramid scheme, right? It's like, oh, just tell two people, and all you got to do is have those two people tell two people. Think of it kind of like that as well, and how some of them kind of branch out. But nonetheless, you typically have a central controller and that type of typology. So again, we talked about denial of service, which is single attacker, single target. The goal, again, tango down. Our goal, right, is to cause disruption in that service so that it can't be used for others. We had a higher review of distributed denial of service, which essentially is just denial of service, but done by multiple people or multiple bots, if you will, multiple entities, devices that are under our control that can send us, or they can send information to the target to try and overwhelm it. And in this example, we'll just talk about web applications, websites. So it's causing the server to be exhausted to the point where it can't respond to what it was designed to do, to serve a web page. So with that said, we'll do a little bit of a tangent here and talk about Open Redirect. We're going to kind of go off in this little side story here for a second, but it'll come around. Open Redirect, or otherwise known as unvalidated redirect or a forward, is very, very, very common. Probably one of the most common vulnerabilities that we see in web applications. And almost every web application uses it. Not all of them have the vulnerability, but there's the potential. So typically the way an open redirect or unvalidated redirect, before we talk about like the open or unvalidated part, let's just talk about the redirect in general. So usually a redirect happens after you log in, right? Or you visit a page. So let's think about how your bank might work, right? So you go to your bank and you log in. Now, when you log in, you're not typically, I don't know, I haven't been to everyone's bank, but typically when you log in, you're presented with another page. You're presented with your dashboard, balance, whatever it is. You're not still looking at that home page. Just think of that. And again, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but just think of that as a type of redirect, right? You go to one URL, you log in, you're redirected to another part of the application. That's the way it's supposed to work. Now, behind the scenes, there should be filters in place that basically say wherever I'm in control of where I'm redirecting you. I'm not redirecting you to some third-party random place. I'm redirecting you within our little ecosystem of the bank's website. That's how it's supposed to work. So trusted site is your bank. You log in, you hit this junction where you go to the desired destination. You're going to your dashboard. Now, let's think of a bank that has this open redirect vulnerability or this forward or unvalidated redirect vulnerability. Now what happens is think of, I send you, this is very, very common in phishing campaigns. We're going to actually leverage this in a more malicious intent or different intent. But for now, let's just kind of go over how the attack actually works and kind of what it's used for traditionally before we hack the attack to do something else. So now let's think that you have a phishing campaign that I've crafted, and I've crafted a URL that is legitimate because it is. You might think of a URL being spoofed where it might say like yourbank.com, and that's just what the URL looks like. But we're smarter than that. We know that if we look under the surface, we're going to see some random URL or text, and it's just the text that we're seeing as the link is being displayed as our bank. But we know that that's not really our bank. If we look at the source or look at the email headers, we can see that that link is not really what it is. In this case, though, the link is really what it is to an extent. So we have like the first part of our link will be like the bank's login. But the redirect part, where after you log in, instead of it continuing on to the bank, we are hijacking it to go somewhere else. So again, a common practice is in phishing world to get credentials, right? So now you log in and you went to your bank's legitimate website, or at least you click the link and you are going to your bank's legitimate website and legitimate login page. That's not spoofed, that's real. But down the line in the link, there's actually where the redirect would be, where it would say like redirect to your dashboard. It actually says redirect somewhere else. So once you log in, now you're redirected to my page, the page I want you to see. And that could be, security reasons, please reset your username and password. And you don't think any otherwise because the link is legitimate and you logged into your bank. You didn't log in to some other random place. So you fill that out, but now I have your credentials. Another one would be is that I forward you to some malicious site where we call what's like a drive-by will happen. And that's like malicious JavaScript or code in the background that gets downloaded and input into your machine. Now your machine's infected. And again, you are none the wiser because you went to a valid link. At least the first part of it was. But the second half you didn't realize was actually malicious. So again, you're being redirected. And this only happens when we don't have that validation in place that says whatever is after the redirect has to be contained and stay within our banking application. Where when that validation is missing, it essentially opens it up to be redirected. Here's some examples. So again, think of this first part, our first half of the URL is a legitimate link to your application or your bank or whatever it is. And then you'll notice these are valid inputs or code, if you will, to redirect to a different part. So let's just think of this URL as just saying dashboard or balance, whatever it is. Just use your imagination for this. So again, we see our real bank's website, and typically we are logging in, we get redirected to dashboard. We log in, we get, or we log out. And instead of still stuck at our dashboard, right, when we log out of our bank, we're presented with another screen. Think of it as a redirect. So for this, we could say, okay, well, we know when they log in, they're going to then get redirected, and then it's going to equal something, and maybe that could be dashboard, that could be status, whatever it is, but we're going to hijack that, and we're going to insert our website that we want them to go to, or our page, or our evil website for a download. of malicious software. And these are what some of these look like. There's probably hundreds of them that exist in real life that it's legit code. The validation should happen though, where it says like we can't allow domains that do not match our domain. That's what. Just think of, again, super high level. It can be more complicated than that, but just think high level. The validation should say do not allow any other domain after this equal sign. And that's what keeps it within this domain, and that's what allows it to only go to the dashboard or only go somewhere else. But without that validation, this is now left open to be anything, to go anywhere. And we just choose to forward them, if you will, to another website. So again, I know this is kind of a tangent, but it'll all make sense here in a minute. And again, these are some examples that can be used, legitimate code that says after you log in or after you do something, this then equals, and then some path or some page. In this instance, we're just leveraging your website. Now think of, instead of trying to phish or scam or get credentials or get someone to download malware, think of how this is working, right? So a user's going here, but then being redirected here. So now let's think of back to distributed denial of service or just denial of service, right? We're trying to attack a target, and we're trying to attack the target in masses, right? That's the only real way we ever have a chance of Tango down, of bringing that application down or making it so busy that it can't reply to other requests. And the only way really to do that is with some type of distributed or amplification, but for now we'll focus on distributed. So we know that open redirect is very, very common. We know there's millions of websites on the web that are vulnerable to this. So again, think of if we knew what all those websites were, and think of, instead of injecting this to some malicious website, we're putting the target's website as the redirect. So now what would happen is that if a person visited this, they would actually be redirected to this. And the attack would look like it's coming from here. This is where the traffic is coming from. But that would take a person to actually do that. We'd have to do like the world's largest phishing campaign and then hoping everyone clicks on it at the same time. But we could still leverage the attack. What if we know that this link exists and we know this application exists, and we can just find a way to automate the idea of putting in a target after the redirect statement, which is this relay state or redirect URL. Here's a few here: proxy, PHP, check, validator. All these things redirect. They all forward to another part of the application. But in this instance, because they're open or they're not validated, they're going to go wherever we tell them to go. So again, think of now, instead of leveraging this for some other attack, we're going to try and think of a very clever way or creative way to leverage this for a distributed attack. Because now, if I know this link, if I know this company's website, and I know that they have open redirect, I can just simply say, have some script that runs this, that appends the target address here. And now when I send a request here, the request actually is going to get forwarded to the target. The traffic is going to look like it's coming from here. So it's kind of doing two things. It's kind of, one, it is enabling me to do an attack at a very wide scale, but it's also kind of covering my footsteps. Obviously, there's some other things that we would want to do, but in a sense, it's not like we're attacking the target directly, and then that can be traced back to us. The attack appears to be coming from, we'll just say, a Bank A's website or something like that. So it'd be very confusing, and actually that's really good because that just might look like normal everyday traffic. Obviously, if we're coming from the same place, attacking over and over again, that's going to look very, very suspicious to any type of device with any type of logic that's basically saying, this doesn't look right, let's block this IP. But this type of attack, again, we could be leveraging, there's millions, literally millions of websites that are prone to this vulnerability. And so, we talked about denial of service, single target, single attacker, distributed, multiple attackers, or a single attacker that controls multiple bots, single target. We talked about bots that basically they're just devices that are under our control. And just think of the high overview of bot. Yes, typically we think of bots as maybe some device that's been infected with malware. We think of Trojans or viruses or rats or worms or whatever those are. We think of like devices that are under control. Like, let's kind of branch out on our scope of what a bot could be and think of, well, this sort of open redirect is is very intriguing, because now I don't have to infect anything with anything. It already exists. I just need to find them. But think of it as just like all these zombies or armies or bots already out there, and we just got to figure out how to gather them and control them. But we don't need to infect anything. We don't need to learn how to code or literally nothing. It's just basically figure out how we can gather them and then how we can leverage them. And that, my friend, is where this tool comes into play. Again, we talked about some notable attacks. We talked about some tools of the trade. Again, going back to denial of service, LOIC, it's a very, very popular one. In the grand scheme of things for the distributed attacks, we think of bots or malware of some sort is very common. But for this, another tool of the trade could be, I don't know that it's been used for a wide scale attack yet, but I would say stay posted, some things to come. But a gentleman by the name of Sai has created this awesome tool. It's been around for a few years now. I've had the pleasure of using it, I think, for the past 5 or 6 years. And it's essentially a DOS or DDoS type of tool that leverages open redirect, specifically literally open redirect. And it has a plethora of different attacks, in which we'll do some demos on. And this is from his website, and UFONet is a free software, a P2P cryptographic distributive toolkit that allows to perform denial of service and distributed denial of service attacks on layer 7 through the exploitation of open redirect vectors, third-party websites, and it also acts as a botnet on layer 3-4 network of using the protocol. Really awesome tool, really smart fella, and yeah, so this is what his tool looks like, what it does. Again, looks just like any other distributed attack. We can proxy through Tor, so we have anonymous traffic hitting these open redirect servers. And then all that traffic is then sent to our target. Again, so if we have access to millions of these websites that are, in fact, I don't want to say infected, but are not properly secure, that essentially are misconfigured and not validating their redirects. If we know if we have a list of them, which is fairly easy to get, and we can essentially send a request to them. And again, the request we're forwarding now to our target. And so we're leveraging this type of distributed denial of service attack by leveraging the open redirect. And I see a question: how can you exploit an open redirect without access to the page in question? Well, the nature of the open redirect essentially is we only need to access the page of the application that is vulnerable to it. So there might be pages within pages deeper. You may be, once you log in, then you find an open redirect. Obviously, that's not going to work for us because we're not providing credentials. We're not logging into anything. We're just finding applications that at the surface are exposed or susceptible to some sort of open redirect, meaning that there are tons of websites out there where when you look at the URL, at the end of the URL, there'll be some redirect statement. And then there's an equal sign. And again, we're just keep this high level. Just imagine an equal sign. And there's some if statement going on in the background. And if you log in, the equals dashboard. But that's only if you log in. Then it puts dashboard after the word, and credentials and all that stuff after the equal sign. For us, we're simply saying there's no need to log in. The statement is already provided by us. The URL is there. The equal sign is there. I can put anything after the equal sign, and that's where it is going to go. It's going to go wherever I tell it to go after the equal. I could type in dashboard, and it won't go there because I'm supposed to put in credentials. I could put in some other page, and it might say 404 or unauthorized. In this instance, I could put in Google and hit enter, and now I'm at Google now. So the attacker is kind of creating the URL, and the server isn't validating correct. So, but the full URL is the one we're creating with the target. But the website itself has already provided us with the initial base path of the URL. Like the bank's website is already providing us with bank.com redirect equals, and it's just waiting for us to log in to equals the dashboard. So half of that is already there, and half of that is already in Google's database for us to scrape or do a search on. Basically any web link that contains some of those strings that I showed you could potentially be vulnerable to open redirect attack. And again, all we're doing is just appending anything after the equal sign. We're just appending our target address. And again, so we'll actually get into that here right now. So let's go over a few things we have going on here. So on the right-hand side of the screen, hopefully you're all still seeing my screen, is my EC2 instance. I'm just running a very, very generic web server, which is what you see on the left. For those who have seen my cookie XSS presentation, I've kind of reused that as just a placeholder, if you will. But anyone that goes to this website, so real quick before anyone visits that, I promise you nothing malicious will happen, but just a real quick overview to those that may not know how servers work or logging works, right? So anytime you visit a web application, there's generally a log, and there's like some log that says who is in the form of an IP address, what time, what page they request, and maybe some browser information, some header information, or what we call user agent information, and things like that that get logged. So what we'll do is tail our access log. So we can see here we've already had some traffic. The server's been up for a little bit. But you'll notice here on the right-hand side, this is what a log looks like. This is an Apache log. This is the access log, to be more specific. And it's logging access, if you will, people that have accessed the website. This is a very, very, very simple website. This is literally just for demonstration purposes. But you'll notice here, when I refresh the page, you're going to see an entry come in. And there you go. You saw an entry here from my VPN. It gives us the date, tells us what we did. We did a GET request to the root directory, which is this index page. We got a 200 response, which is good. 200 is good. Awesome. I see some either bots are doing this or people. Great. I love it. But we get a little bit of information, right? We see what came in. We see, I bet that was Kevin. I don't want to say that, but maybe somebody that knows about how these logs work. So essentially, it's logging the page we're trying to access. Again, in my instance, I just did a GET to the home page. I could type in anything. Let's just say I'm trying to see, maybe I want to see if there's an admin login page here. Well, sure enough, on the front end, I see that it's not found. But on the back end, I see that there is a request made here. And I love the fact that somebody put this, because this is how I used to, me and a friend, that's how nerdy we are, we used to talk to each other through access logs. Because literally anything you put after, in the URL is going to get logged, because essentially the server is saying, hey, we're logging a request for this. And obviously this is a 404, that page doesn't exist, and this is some of the information that it tells you. So here's a great way, a very, very simple and effective way to see traffic. There are a lot of other ways to do this, trust me. This is just a crude, simple, fun way to do it. Spin up a web server, look at the access log, just sit and wait. I promise you, even if you've never registered your domain name when you're using an IP address, even if you've never told anybody about your website, I promise you, people will visit it. And mostly it's going to be bots that are just scanning the internet, whether it be just for logging or malicious purposes. But I promise you, you will get visitors if it's public facing. I will say that. Obviously, if it's on your home network, if you see somebody visiting that, I would say you probably have some other things to worry about. But if it's public facing, I promise you that you will eventually get hits. I've seen multiple attacks come in from everywhere. It's like staring at fire for me. I could literally just sit and watch this all day long. I'll look at IP addresses, do a geo tracker, see where they're from, who the IP address is, and just to see where all the stuff is coming from. It's I don't know. It's kind of soothing in a really weird in a really weird way. So again, if you visit this website, I promise you nothing malicious is going to happen, other than we will see an address come in, although we have no idea of who that address belongs to. So feel free to visit the site. But again, anytime I visit it, we're going to get my VPN IP. We're going to see some date information, the request that was done, the response that was given, and then some information about maybe the browser, or we call the user agent that was visiting this site. So with that said, let's get into some of the fun stuff here. And again, depending on the attacks, which we're going to do actually a couple attacks. I know we're going to kind of deviate a little bit from the talk, which was distributed denial of service. This is going to kind of play into that, but then we're going to just have a little bit of fun. But yeah. So anyway, so let's get to back to our Kali instance. So a few things we'll talk about. So first, we will talk a little bit about the UFO.net. Actually, first let's get into One of the examples we talked about for just denial of service, right? We talked about this is a single attacker, single target, and one of those attacks was an HTTP flutter. So what I have done is just scripted what started off as just for fun, a simple HTTP flutter Python script has morphed into this monster of a beast that I'm now still working on. I don't know why, but it's been very, very fun. Anyway, so I've scripted a Python script to flood, to send GET requests, which again is exactly what the HTTP flutter is going to do. It's going to essentially, it's the equivalent of hitting refresh over and over and over again. So again, if I come back to my Cookie Monster site, if I hit refresh, it logs it. Hit refresh, I can just keep hitting refresh, right? That's very, very tedious. But you see on the right-hand side what's happening to the log. You see that it's just the same thing over and over again. Now, to do that enough times to bring one, it would never happen. A person can just not click fast enough or generate enough traffic by clicking the refresh button over and over again. But just for all intents and purposes of the demonstration, think of a way if you could magnify that like to a much greater extent, as if you were, able to press that button 100 times a second. Think about that ability. Now you might be getting somewhere. You might be able to send enough. Now, what about if you could do it like 1,000 times a second or whatever it is? Can't you tell this is PowerShell? So I came up with a little script. I wrote in Python here, and just real quick over some of the options. I'll put this, actually, let me do this. I should have done it in the beginning. Let me give you guys a link to the generic base version of this script, and you guys feel free to download it right now. I don't know who's on what right now, what system, if they have Python accessible. I will say, just give me a second before you launch it. Just give me a minute. But here is the actual page. I'm going to put this in the chat to everyone. So this is in my Git. It's one of the first iterations of the script that I wrote. So I pasted it in the chat. Please feel free to download it. If you're not sure how, you can go to the raw. Once you click on this link, you can click on raw and then copy that URL and do a wget, or just download it from here if you're on Windows or whatever. Anyway, however, I don't want to tell you how to get it, but once you figure it out and you have Python, you can run this. Just hold off for a second. Let me first do a demonstration, then I'll let you guys run rampant. But so essentially, these are some of the options, right? So we have to give it a target. So that's going to be the IP address of the website. And actually, before we do that, let me copy that real quick. So we have to give it a target. We have to say the number of requests to send, right? That's the whole purpose of this application, is to flood. So we need to give it a number of requests. We'll give it some arbitrary number. And there's some other things that I added that aren't required for it to work. In the version you're going to get, it's pretty much just going to be target, request. That's it. You can figure out other things to add, or talk to me offline and I'll give you an updated version. But nonetheless, at least we have to put in two things: the target and then the number of rounds that we're going to hit it with. So for that, we're just going to do a -t. We're going to input our address here, and we actually don't need the HTTP. It will resolve DNS, so you can feel free to put in the URL. You don't need to put www, just FQD in. And then again, we have to supply it with rounds. So for this, let's just start off with, we'll just say 10. So what this version is going to do is it's first going to check to see if the target is alive. The version that you guys have access to, it's just going to assume it's alive, and it's just going to try and send it stuff. But nonetheless, it works 100%. But for the instance that you're going to see here, it's going to first check to see if it's up. So on the right-hand side, you're going to see it do a little bit of a request. It's going to ask it, are you alive, which doesn't really matter. But it's essentially looking for a 200 response, right? We know that a 200 response means that page exists. If it sees that, then it's going to come back and say, we saw this, let's move forward with the attack. So when I press enter, on the right-hand side, you should see a request come in, checking is the target up. There you go. It says, are you alive? We got a 200. On the left-hand side, sure enough, target is up. Let's start the flood. So now it ran through 10 sends, if you will. I could up those rounds to 100. It's going to do the same thing. It's going to check to see if the target is up. and it's going to get a 200. Sure, it must be alive. Let's start the Flutter, and again, it's just going to send 100 responses, or 100 GET requests, I should say. So again, this alone wouldn't take down an application, but you get the idea, right, of how a Flutter could work and what it might look like, right? We're essentially just sending enormous amounts of requests to the server, trying to keep it busy enough that it can't answer other people's requests. There's better ways to do this. There's more efficient ways. There's ways to multiply attacks. There's a lot of, obviously, ways to expand on this. But at the core, I just wanted you guys to see, like, one, what a Flutter might look like at the application level of, like, well, what does a Flutter do or look like? Essentially, it's just sending a bunch of requests. But then also, what does it look like to the server? So a question is, can you change the size of the request? So in my version that is available both in what's on my Git and what you're seeing here, does not have that ability, but it could very, very, very easily, I could put in a request or a flag to enter byte size or packet size of that nature. Or I could change it from a Git to a post. Those who maybe know how, like, CDNs work or other types of firewalls or things like that know that sometimes a site might be cached, and so you're actually interacting with the cached version of the site. The server actually isn't doing anything at that point for types of GET requests. And I want to thank Char for bringing that up, because it's a very good point. But though if you're posting something, like if you're trying to interact with the site in such a way that you're trying to ask for data or manipulate data with a post request, those requests usually do go through. That's when the CDN might say, or the WAF might say, or whatever is caching something, might say, hey, we don't have this cached, so we have to actually let you make that request to the server. And Arian just posted some awesome links. So we do have LOIC. We have HOIC, which was the updated version of LOIC. Slow Loris, which we'll actually talk about. And then there's my GETFlooder. So awesome attacks. Extremely crafty, basically just knowing how a server works and how to manipulate or exploit how they work. And we'll talk about some of those more attacks in a minute. But again, I just wanted to give you a kind of a brief overview of what an HTTP Flutter looks like. And you can see here that though it's cool, I can send a whole lot of requests fairly quickly. Now, if a whole bunch of my friends had this, if we all got together, all 500 members of SBWASP, did this to some poor site, it would probably have a little bit of an impact maybe. And if we just, kept this running, instead of doing 1,000, we just put in 1 million or something, and we were all doing that, it would probably show up on someone's radar, being like, hey, what's going on here? It might impact the server a little bit. It would take a lot to actually bring something down nowadays, but nonetheless, you get the idea. This just runs as many rounds as I tell it to send. It's going to send. My EC2 instance is probably really freaking out though. But this is just the beginning. We're going to really we're going to torture it for sure. So right now you can see it's approaching 1,000. That's what I put in, and at some point there is logic in here that if for some reason somebody doing what looks like an attack. If for some reason the application went down or did something, we would see this status, this 200, change to something else. So if it changes to anything else, which we're probably not going to see, there's a little bit of logic in the script that's like Tango down. Like if all of a sudden that 200 went to something else, something's going on with that page, and could mean that there's a disruption in the service. So there is a little bit of logic in that. The version that I have has a lot more logic, but again, the meat and potatoes is in that script that I sent out to you guys. So that's flooding, right? Very, very crude, literally is what it sounds like. I'm literally flooding with just a bunch of HTTP requests, hoping that I could do so many, generate so much traffic that website doesn't respond very well. Real quick, let's dive into the UFONet, which is the tool that's leveraging the open redirect. So this is a lot more fascinating, right? Because again, we're leveraging applications that aren't validating the redirect laws or rules, and we're piggybacking off of those to inject our target, and we're redirecting traffic through one site to another one. So the attack traffic kind of appears to look like it's coming from another site. So that's one cool thing, right? But the other cool thing is, again, now we have millions of potential bots, botnets, whatever you want to call them, zombies. I love the word zombie. I'm a huge zombie fan. So apparently is this guy, which is why we connected. He calls his bots zombies. Humans, which we'll look at. So right now, humans are what I've gathered from scraping the web for potential applications. Well, I should say applications that are using redirect, right? They're 100% using redirect. They may not be open, or they might not be like unvalidated, but they are using redirect. So I've just gathered over 2 million websites, URLs that are using redirect of some form or another, right? There's way many more out there. That's just what I had the time that I felt like sitting through while I was harvesting them. Then what you do is you try and convert your humans to zombies. And then when you do that, you essentially you find out if in fact they're actually vulnerable. So I didn't even let it run that long, but I let it run for a little while doing some tests. And I basically now have verified 2,500 servers that are susceptible to open redirect, that are not validating redirects. So essentially, without coding anything, without knowing how to make malware, without renting some malware bot, I have 2,500 servers at my disposal to send open redirects through, which we will do. So you're going to see what a distributed denial of service attack might look like. So we already saw what a flood looks like. Essentially, it's just obviously all from the same target. You see, from the same IP address, and it's the same request. I mean, this is obvious. If you saw this, you would clearly think this is something malicious or something weird is happening for you to see this many requests in that short period of time from the same thing. That's pretty suspicious. The next attack we're about to run is going to be a little bit more harder to see. Now, also picture that in a normal, a large website is going to have lots of traffic, right? So if we were looking at a log of, like, let's just say like a bank's website, Target, any other like just large corporation's website, if we were looking at the logs coming in, it would be close to like a blur. I mean, there would be just tons and tons of requests coming in. So this thing would be lighting up like a Christmas tree, and it'd be super, super busy. So we've added traffic from random other IPs, and it'd be pretty hard to detect visually. And even with certain logic detection tests, it would be very, very difficult to pick up a distributed attack. Especially a distributed attack like this, where it is coming from different places, but it's not like the same. It's hard to explain, but think of it as, yes, the attacks are coming in from different places, but usually within a distributed attack through bots, the traffic looks the same. It's just the same from different locations. A little bit, again, easier to detect. Where in this type of approach, the traffic might be a little bit harder to differentiate, because each time, and again, there are ways that this has been addressed in doing some distributed attacks using bots to randomize headers, randomize IPs. But nonetheless, this is just, again, I would say a very open source, easy way to simulate this type of attack. And this is not a toy. This is not for educational purposes. This is very explicitly pointed out on his website that you are using at your own risk. So I just definitely want to get that disclaimer out there. I myself, I am attacking my own application. I'm also not attacking an application on a shared server. So just because you think you own the website that you have a right to attack it, you are very mistaken. If you are running on, say, like GoDaddy or any other shared service, you are essentially attacking many other applications, because that is not your dedicated box. So please know that. Obviously, if you have an internal network, get a Raspberry Pi, or just spin up a LAMP stack, or just any web server, attack yourself. It looks awesome. You could do this exact same thing at home. Or again, spin up an EC2 instance. They're practically free. I mean, they are. After a while, you'll start being charged maybe just to have the instance or for the storage or whatever. But it's negligible. I mean, literally like maybe $1 a month to have an EC2 instance up most of the time. So just please be aware of, even if you think you do own your own website, just please be aware of the environment, that you could be affecting more than just yourself. So reach out to whoever that provider is to get permission or whatever form you might need to fill out. But in this exercise, I'm attacking myself, my own EC2 instance. So for this, we're gonna do, there's a couple cool little things built into this. One is, let's just do I on our, which is information, on the quote unquote target. So this is going to reach out to my server, and it's just going to give me a little bit of information. So I found an image, which is very true. There's the Cookie Monster image, and then it really didn't find anything else. This application is fairly smart. I could technically leverage the image in a GET request to pull an image, right? Obviously, a single GET request is, I mean, I could probably send millions to it, and the server would just blink an eye. But if I'm sending millions of requests to, say, pull an image, and it's a very large image, maybe it's the background image, or maybe it's a movie, or maybe it's something that just is whatever the largest file is on that application, if millions of people are requesting that, that's going to definitely do some damage to that application. And that's something that most probable, like whatever's sitting in front of the application caching, is probably not going to have that on hand, if I had to guess. So it's going to start actually trying to retrieve that from the server. At that point, now the CDN is attacking your application, which is brilliant. But anyway, so that's one little cool thing we could do. We could change the I to an X, which is called abduction in UFONet land. Abduction is really cool because now it's going to see if there's maybe a WAF in front of it. Try and fingerprint some server information, although yes, it can be spoofed, but usually not. Check if there's something in front. Again, WAF or IDS doesn't detect it. And it's also really cool, almost running like a NIC2, where it's going to give us some CVEs. I recently did an update because I wasn't running the latest version of Apache, but it pointed that out to me. It did point out that I was not running that. So if I was running some other vulnerable version of Apache, this might be something. Although for this purpose, I could care less about what vulnerabilities exist. I'm just solely interested on this distributed attack. But in Recon, this is awesome information. Again, and we'll do a NIC2 and a DIRB just so you can kind of see what they look like. But to kind of keep things going with distributed attack, we saw what a flutter looks like. Pretty obvious. Looks like a lot of traffic from the same person. For this instance, we're going to go and we're going to look at some examples. Oops. I think, is it single or double? Here we go. So here's some examples of chains of attacks. So here's the attacks themselves that we can do, and kind of what they are, slow or fast. And as actually Arian pointed out, there's the Slorus or Loris attack, which is a very slow HTTP request attack. It's kind of like it asks for a service very, very, very slowly. Like it sends header information saying like, hey, I'm about to do something that's like a million bytes long, and then it moves like a sloth, trying to get the resource, eat up all those resources. So for this instance, we're going to just throw the kitchen sink just for display purposes. So we're going to run the Armageddon, I love it, attack, and against this thing. Yeah. And give me 1 second here. I'm gonna replace that target with our target, our IP address. And 1 second. And then we'll see kind of what a distributed attack might look like. All right. All right, so we have our, calling our script. We have all of our stuff filled in. So these are all the attacks it's going to run, and all these numbers represent rounds. So as my Flutter worked in rounds, think of a round though as really just a single attack. So if I put in a 1, it's going to send 1 request. If I put in 10, it's going to send 10 requests. This is sort of similar in the idea that rounds, but each of these attacks are going to go through rounds. So I'm doing an actual low attack, but these are rounds. So it's going to go through, and it's going to leverage my 2,500 bots, if you will, my armies. So it's going to send 1,000 requests to each of those 2,500 bots, if you will. So this is going to be a massive attack. I'm literally throwing everything that this thing can pretty much do with limited resources, obviously, from my system, and then from the amount of zombies I have. I only have 2,500. That sounds like a lot, but obviously 2 million would be great. If I could convert all those humans to zombies, that would be epic. But nonetheless, you could if you spent enough time. And again, the world is full of these applications that are vulnerable. But anyway, we'll kick this off. It's going to basically ask me for a password because some of these attacks do require a password. And basically, it's going to look at the application. This is what it sent to check to see if it's alive. It got a 200 back. It's saying, hey, it's alive. Are you sure you want to continue? And we're going to be off to the races here. So it's going to cycle through round 1 of 100 of 1,000 different types of attacks. So you can see here, it's going to slowly start ramping up. My poor little EC2 instance is going to try and do its best to keep up, but it's going to be kind of jittery. So imagine what you're seeing on the right-hand side, probably double that. It's really just doing its best to try and keep up. But now look at this. Now we have a lot of traffic being generated from multiple different IP addresses. Some of these addresses are going to be reflected from my VPN because that's where it's coming from. But then a lot of the actual addresses are going to be from the zombies that we found. And so we're going to get a mixture of addresses. And to the server, again, that's what it looks like where the traffic's coming from because we're leveraging that redirect. So Jonathan asked a question, can you explain human versus zombies thing? So again, humans, I scraped humans. Humans are websites that are using redirect, that are not vulnerable to open redirect or have some sort of vulnerable configuration. They're just using, they meet the search criteria that I put in. So remember back when we were looking at like redirect equals PHP question mark, like redirect URI validate, all those little sort of sample snippets that would be in the URL. I'm looking for websites that contain those. That doesn't mean they're vulnerable. It just means that they are capable of using redirect. Those websites function off of redirect functions. So that's all where the humans are gathered. And that's why you have millions of them. If I let this thing run, overnight or through a couple of days, it would probably be upwards of millions and millions. I let it run for a few hours and I found, 2 million whatever applications that are using redirect. It doesn't mean it's open redirect. It doesn't mean they're not validating. It just means they're using redirect. So that's what a human is. Zombies are, once I take that human log and then I run a test against it, and this application allows you to do that, the test then will verify. So the test essentially will send a single request to that application, to yourself, to see if in fact it redirects, to you. If it does, then now we know that it's vulnerable to redirect. If it doesn't, then we know that it's just using direct but not vulnerable. That does not become a zombie. If we send a request to it with our own self, to it, because we don't need to put in the target to test, we just say test. And if it passes the test, then that means that it is susceptible to open redirect. It is not validating, and that human then gets turned into a zombie. So that's the two different ones and how that works. So you can see here, like this is not gone through a round yet. On the left-hand side, I don't think it has anyway. You'll notice that this traffic will kind of pause for a second, and you'll quickly see like round 2 of 100, and then you'll see the flood come in again. But nonetheless, that's just default. I haven't tweaked anything. I haven't done anything. I haven't leveraged, a file size. I haven't leveraged maybe like the one of the larger files on the actual application. This is just out of the box. There's round 2 just started. So that was round 1 of many. I just kind of, out of the box for this demonstration. I did spend some time harvesting humans and zombies, but for the most part, I've not done anything that anyone that just has, stumbled across this application and just used right out of the box. Other than zombies, obviously that matters because I think default you get 4. So you need to kind of find your own. But nonetheless, you could still simulate what a distributed attack might look like. Or, some people will leverage these as stress testers, like, oh, I want to test my application. How can I generate, thousands of what could be traffic to my application to make sure it can handle that, and make sure my load balancer can handle that. And there's tons of tools, open source and paid, out there. But this is just really cool because I think it has more of a hacker intent to it. Again, it's not a toy. It's not meant for educational purposes. It's literally meant to exploit open redirect. So I wouldn't even necessarily argue this is even meant to stress test, although you could definitely use it for that. I think the intentions are pretty clear here. Another Google Dorks, yes, Google Dorks is what was used. It does have a built-in function, although there's a scrape. You can write your own sort of scraper, if you will, to scrape and then post to a text file, and then cat that text file into humans, or just rename it humans, and then UFONet will go through that file and then run a test against it. So you can obviously scrape your own. You can try and have the application find them for you. I did both just to try and expedite the process of finding them, just for this presentation. But nonetheless, like, this will literally just do this all day long, and this is just cycling through the different attacks that we saw when I did the examples, and we literally used Apocalypse, or whatever it was called, it pretty much is using every attack that it offers, and we're leveraging them against those 2,500 zombies. So it's sending these requests to those, which, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see all the IP addresses that it's sending to, and those are the initial URLs that are then getting redirected. The traffic then getting redirected. So we're sending a request to site A that redirects, and then that's getting forwarded over to site B, and site B is our target. Let's see here. Another question: could the zombie be configured to alert admins if their servers are being used as an open redirect? Honeypots are doing this. So yeah, it's hard to tell because I'm not validating the millions of ones that are out there. I'm just kind of just rolling with it. So I don't know if some of these are honeypots. I'm sure some of these are honeypots. I guarantee that some of these are honeypots, and that they're being logged. But and again, if we were actually being malicious, there are a few other things we'd probably want to do to cover our tracks. I'd probably want to leverage Tor. I'm a huge fan of Tor Ghost. For those that you don't know, Tor Ghost is a plugin. I'll actually just stop this. There's Tor Ghost is a file or an install that you can do on your Kali Linux that leverages Tor. So obviously you have to have Tor installed. That just routes all traffic, not just like Tor. Typically, you get the browser, your web browser traffic is obfuscated through Tor, and then to get your whole network traffic off of that box, you typically would set up a proxy or some sort of something or whatever, a proxy through Tor. Tor Ghost kind of does that for you. It's super easy to set up and super easy to start, stop, and all that. But think of it like a service that leverages that. So I could start that, and that'll give me a Tor address. It'll route all my traffic through Tor using Tor Ghost. And then all my requests are actually sent through that. A little bit slower, obviously, anytime we're using some sort of node, Tor, proxy, whatever it is, things are going to be slower. But again, to really do damage, obviously, even though we're leveraging, say if, 1 million applications to redirect, that's still, depending on who you're attacking, could be like chump change. I mean, like Facebook, millions of people probably every second hitting their application or whatever's in front of it, whatever CDN they're using. So, just because you can generate a ton of traffic and send it and do it anonymously, it doesn't mean that you're actually going to do some damage. But nonetheless, really the whole purpose of this demo was to just give you an idea of what denial of service looks like versus distributed, what some of the attacks look like to a server. I'll actually show you what a RASP, how that logs these attacks and what that looks like. Just again, it was, for demonstration purposes. I'm sure my Amazon instance that was flipping out, and I'll show you some stats on that in a second here. But real quick, I just wanted to jump over to some common recon that an attacker may do, or a red teamer. And what that looks like. Because some people, you know, use applications and they're maybe not aware of what that looks like to whatever it is that they're doing that against. So a very common one, especially in MySpace, in my world, is DIRB, right? And essentially DIRB is a directorial traversal tool. Essentially, it has a dictionary, if you will, or a file of what it believes to be known paths, known URLs that exist that might pose interest to someone. It might be an admin, it might be a login page, whatever it is. There's like thousands of these like lists, these endpoints, if you will, and it's kind of database, and it tries all of them. And if it gets to 200, it's like, this might be interesting, and it kind of logs that and keeps moving. Then it circles back around to it, but it lets you know. It's kind of a way of like crawling, but with a predefined scope. It's not like a smart crawl. It's not crawling for links that it's found. It's really just trying all these different paths and then seeing what the response code is. And if it's 200, that's a good indication that it could be alive. That page really exists. If it's anything else, it probably means that page doesn't exist, or maybe you don't have authorized permission to get into it. So again, I've run this tool, I can't even count how many times. It's very, very a common tool we in the AppSec land will run to try and map out an application that we have an engagement on, or that we're just trying to figure out what other endpoints are. Because again, you could manually click around and find things, but this is going to do that a lot quicker. And again, there's a reason for every tool. Obviously, I still might want to visit the website, click around on some things, but this could also help, again, expedite what links may exist. And you might have a website that has links that you're not aware of, that there is no URL or menu for it. So this is going to sort of check those things, but we'll see kind of what that looks like. So this is basically a Flutter, if you think about it. I'm kind of performing an attack, if you will. I'm sending massive amounts of GET requests. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see them flying by. On the left-hand side, you can see what it's trying. So I have my root FQDN, and then it's trying all these other pages, if you will. And again, this is a sort of a static list. I mean, you can update it, obviously. It's not dynamic. This is just set. So whatever is in this file, it's going to just go through. And if it gets 200, it's going to kind of flag it and then keep moving and maybe come back. But for the most part, it's just literally trying stuff. And you can see them over here. You can see the GET, and you can see the slash of what it's trying. It reflects, it's a 1-to-1 ratio here. So it found an index, which is the home page. So it gave me a 200, logged it, and moved on. It also found that there's PHP in the info page, which there is. I installed PHP on that. And there is an info page. There'll be one more that it will find. But nonetheless, like, this is just kind of how DIRB works. I'm sure some of you may be familiar, some of you may not. It's a tool that we use. But again, this is what it looks like. So with that said, whenever you run this tool against some target, this is the noise you're making, unless you're putting in some flag or something to slow this down, which will take probably eons for it to finish. This is what it looks like. So I guarantee you, whoever is monitoring, if there is such a person or a device, is gonna notice that very quickly, because this isn't normal traffic. A normal single person isn't generating 5,000 404s. They're not that naive of how the website works to click around to get that many errors or that many attempts on pages that don't exist. So I just used the standard, again, configuration, nothing special, just out of the box, just ran it with the common word list that it has. There are other ones, but that's just what it uses by default. And it ran about 4,600 GET requests. So it tried about 4,600 common paths, right? So that's what that attack, that's what I don't want to call it attack, but that's what that recon looks like. So again, be careful. Another very, very common one, dear to my heart, NIC2. NIC2 is kind of a recon tool, although it does, there are some attacks that it does as well. I kind of think of it as a hybrid, but I personally mainly use it for recon. And this is to scope the application to see if there are any known vulnerabilities that might exist. This particular flag is going to generate a lot of noise. I'm doing that on purpose. Again, the same thing. This is going to go through a list of different directories, different actual attacks. But again, I kind of kind of think of this more of like a recon tool. But again, be very careful of the tools that you use when you're using them and why you're using them. A quick question came up, Citizen, does UFONet have an implementation of DERB? If it does, I'm not aware of it. I have been using that tool for quite a few years, but in a very narrow scope. There's more to meets the surface than what I went over. I probably went over maybe 30% of the tool's capability. Yeah, Kevin makes a good point. He brought up in the chat, GoBuster is a very, very common. I believe all these are also in Cali. UFO is not in Cali, although it's easy to get. There's a Git repo, but DERB is in Cali by default. I think GoBuster might be. Nick2 is in Cali by default. So there are a ton of tools that are just default in Cali to experiment with. So this instance, again, for all intents and purposes, on the left-hand side, looks pretty harmless. I entered in a command and I gave it an IP address. I entered one little flag. It seems to maybe be doing something. I mean, I know what it's doing, but I'm just speaking as if I never ran this, for the first time. Looks kind of harmless. I don't really know what it's doing. It's just giving me back some information as it sits there doing whatever it's doing behind the scenes. But realistically, if you look on the right-hand side, that's what the server looks like. I've just lit it up essentially with all these requests. Technically, if a lot of people were doing this at the same time, that could be seen as a type of attack or a flood type of attack. But realistically, I mean, the tool is really just trying to do some recon for me. It's looking at different directories. It's trying to maybe grab some banners and see like what versions of things are running. Doing types of traversals to see if it's susceptible to other types of attacks. And then it's going to spit out maybe some CVEs or some known vulns that I could then research and look up and then maybe get a better idea of an attack surface for the application. Again, just like UFONet did when I did the abduction, when I did the X flag, kind of did something similar, although a little less intrusive. But it did, nonetheless, it did give me back some information about what's going on with that server that I could then research and maybe find another foothold. Maybe it's running an older version of something. It's just, again, I'm trying to find different attack points. Again, I know we're kind of going off topic a little bit, but at this point, it's just more of just kind of wanting to have fun, show you guys a few things some tools you may come across, but at the same time, it's still, in a sense, related to a type of denial of service or distributed type of attack just by the nature of how they work. And then for me, it's just kind of twofold because one, I wanted to show you guys what the attack actually looks like. And then two, these kind of fall into categories of attacks we've already talked about with the type of flood attacks, just sheer amounts of traffic. So again, this would be considered a denial of service. I'm just sending massive amounts of requests, specifically like an HTTP floodder. But that's really not what the tool is trying to do. The tool is really just trying to gather information. It just so happens that in doing that, it's generating a lot of traffic. So again, you could get a bunch of your friends together and run Nick2 at something, and again, I doubt it would do anything, but the logs would light up kind of like this as far as it's busy. So we'll let this run for just a little bit longer. It should finish up here shortly. And that'll pretty much conclude. We're going to look at a few other things. We won't talk about remediation too much, but we will get into remediation a little bit with some of the things that are out there that would detect this is happening and alert. So more reactive. And then a few little things that actually would combat something like this. Again, most of the stuff is reactive. Most tools that are monitoring logs have some sort of threshold, and all of a sudden that threshold gets crossed, and then X happens. And then that might then go through another stage of being monitored, and then something happens, then Y happens. And maybe that Y is an IP block or something like that. So again, a little easy to do on these types of attacks if we were just considering this an attack because it's coming from a single address, lots of requests over and over, block that address, boom, problem solved. Distributed is a whole different beast because it's coming from multiple addresses, tens of thousands of addresses, millions of addresses that the traffic is coming from. And at first, usually by the time it's found, it's too late, because usually by the time anything has to react, the damage has already been done because of so many requests. And if you spend any time in this space on a blue team of knowing like how logs work, monitoring works, how like what the response time is, you kind of know your window. So I know if response time is a few minutes or an hour before a certain device is going to alert, or if there's a human involved, what their protocols are. It kind of gives me a little bit of a leeway. And the analogy I use is like in bank robber movies, they get into the bank and they're always calling time. They always know how long it's going to take for the cops to get there, right? They're always looking at their watch and they're like, 1 minute. And so they know they have 1 minute before the cops show up, because they know the alarm's already been triggered, or they're just assuming it. And then, later on you hear them call, 45 seconds. So they're kind of aware of that response time, and they're trying to work within that window. Very similar to something like this, where if you know the response time of what's monitoring the attack, then you can kind of use that to your advantage. That could tell you like how long you could send something before it's potentially going to be picked up, or it just kind of maybe betters your odds or your chances. So in this instance, with a distributed attack, if it's coming from millions of different infected devices, or in this case, millions of different servers that are vulnerable to open redirect, by the time intervention starts, the server is probably down at that point. So there are probably multiple alarms at that point going off. One for flooding, for just traffic in general, exceeding traffic, exceeding bandwidth. A lot of companies pay for bandwidth, and so there's usually thresholds set to be alerts like, hey, your Friday special 25% discount is really taken off, and you got a ton of shoppers on your site. But that's great, but it's also you're exceeding your bandwidth, kind of like back in the day when there were minutes, for your cell phone. You kind of had to kind of be careful of how many minutes you used. There are still a lot of companies out there that leverage services that kind of run off of that logic of you pay for bandwidth. So there's usually thresholds that are put in just for budget's sake. So obviously, again, lots of alarms could be tripped in these types of attacks. For us, if floodgates open, there's some monitoring. Yes, I do have IP blocking off, obviously, for this presentation. I don't want it to stop halfway. But we'll see kind of like what maybe like an enterprise level RASP or WAF, what that might look like after we kind of let this thing run on some of our attacks, and what the traffic might look like. We'll also look at the EC2 instance that this is running on, and see that that's skyrocketed from its lull at rest to all these requests we're giving it. So I'll just stop this because it's gonna be a while, and we'll flip over to we'll look over to the instance and what this monitoring looks like. And let me refresh. And we'll see. You can see here, like, definitely we see some activity and the amount of requests on the network side and what that looks like. So we definitely see some traffic here. I don't have any like monitoring or alerting or alarms. You could set them. You can have AWS monitor. Again, this is just my quote unquote free little EC2 instance that's hosting this. We'll look at an enterprise WAF, or I should say a RASP. Definitely don't want to mix those up. This is Rapid7's T-cell, a RASP. I don't want to get too far into it. That's not really the purpose of this, but just know that there are tools out there with logic that will alert. It will have steps, mitigations for these types of things. Brian brought up a good point in the chat. Cloudflare, that's probably one of the largest CDNs that most companies would use for things like this. So CDN, Content Delivery Network, again, think of it as a company that's sort of caching your pages and acting as your firewall to prevent things like this. Caching is great because your application could essentially be faster, because now they kind of clone your website throughout the globe, different servers. Obviously, if someone in Asia is getting to your website in USA, it's a longer trip than if that site was hosted in Asia. So CDNs kind of do, again, at high level, think of it like that, as it copying your site to various locations so that that traffic it just makes for a better experience, a quicker response time to your application. Also think of them as a type of buffer to your server. They're sitting in front of it. So they're going to take the beating for whatever, for the most part, whatever is actually happening. This WAF, or this is actually a RASP, that is not a CDN. These are, think of other devices like a firewall, a web application firewall is a WAF. That sits in front of the application, has some logic to it. A RASP, which is what you're looking at here from T-cell, is, think of it as like side loading. It's at the process level. So this is actually inspecting the requests that come in Apache. So this is like hooked into Apache, and it's monitoring what Apache is actually doing. And it knows what is good and knows what is bad, and essentially would basically say, like, don't do that, or don't allow that. So I don't think one is better than the other in the entirety sense. I wouldn't pick one over the other, WAF or RASP, but I would recommend both. They both have their pros, they both have their cons. Yeah, anyway, so that's that. But anyway, so there's tools out there. I know that's going to come up like, hey, what could I use to see this? Or if I'm a web developer, what could I put in front of my application? If you haven't already heard of those terms, I'm sure you will shortly. In whatever courses you're taking or just whatever research you're doing, they're very common, the WAF and the RASP. And then the CDN as well. Most companies, again, will use CDN. Cloudflare is probably one of the most popular ones out there. There are a few others. But nonetheless, again, I wanted to bring this up because what you may be doing, there's a lot going on under the hood and a lot of other moving parts. And I just want you to be aware of those. So again, we saw what a flutter looks like, pretty obvious to detect. And again, we can definitely see when what that kind of traffic kind of looks like. A distributed attack, again, we saw what that looked like, lots of traffic. But again, it's a little hard to differentiate because it's coming from so many different endpoints, so many different attackers, if you will. And again, unless you have some really smart logic, it might not pick up on those until it's too late. So just know that whatever you're doing on a website, know that it's being monitored. So please use caution, whether you own it or not, or you're getting permission. Again, going back to what because you own the site, you think you have a right to attack it. That's not always the case. Oh, awesome! Is this the Rick Roll? Props. If you're looking at the logs, it's like a user agent Rickroll, again, because you can enter information in as a user agent, and when that request gets sent, the server picks it up. So kudos to 196. Fail to ban. So that was a question by Linux Girl. So yeah, think of fail to ban as essentially a service that would block or IP addresses. There's other logic you can do at the server level and implement things that kind of come within the framework you're using, Apache or whatever. But fail to ban is another very, very common application that people will use to either block addresses outright, which I could do with a .htaccess rule, or just configure within my server that says basically do not allow anyone from this IP address range. Say for whatever reason, I don't want. I'm a small town, shop, and I'm selling some stuff. I can't do orders from out of state or globally. I'm just not that that type of shop. So I could basically maybe say block any requests from X places, just to kind of keep things under control over my ability to sell it or ship it whatever the widget. Fail to ban is also, again, I think there's some logic. I have a lot of friends that use it. I haven't touched it in a while. But you can essentially set up some rules of like, hey, if you see this, do this. if there's a lot of traffic or whatever, maybe block this IP address for an extended period of time or indefinitely. It's another very, very popular service. And so there's lots of them out there. There's services, paid services, free services, things you could do on your own without leveraging third-party tools, whether they're free or paid for, to try and mitigate some of this stuff. And most of the time at the enterprise level, it's usually going to be a third party, usually a fairly well-known one, and it's either going to be a CDN or a combination of multiple things. Obviously, you don't want to have one single point of failure, so it's very, very common for places to have a CDN like Cloudflare, still have a WASP, still have a RASP, because there's no one silver bullet, there's no one thing that can cover everything. And so it's probably better to have that kind of, what do they call it, like vendor diversity anyway, to not rely on one sole vendor to try and cover all the bases. So again, there's lots of good reasons of why you would want to maybe mix things up. But so yeah, so that's in a nutshell, basically what distributed denial of service looks like versus denial of service, what some of the attacks are, and kind of some demonstrations on what it's kind of doing to the server. We saw some of the stats, although very crude and rough on AWS. Most importantly, we saw the log itself. As we could see, very, very busy. Logs do roll over. So essentially, you could also, granted, this would probably be in wishful thinking, but logs roll over, logs are created. So enough, basically out of X amount of traffic, that log gets zipped up, and then a round robin happens. A new log is created and starts. Logs take up space. That's a finite that's a finite area. So there's also been times that not only is traffic an issue of bandwidth, but space on the actual server is an issue, because again, logs take up space. Logs are always being written. Usually they're offloaded, but again, we're kind of speaking in kind of generalities of types of attacks or things to think about. There's plenty of ways to mitigate all of this stuff, but again, just things to think about, because maybe you didn't think about, oh, there's logs. Oh wow, I ran out of disk space because I forgot to delete them or move them, and now my server doesn't work. Again, just little things like that. But for the most part, that's pretty much it. That's the demonstration. I appreciate everyone. I still want whoever that rickrolled me, PM me. I want to know what you used to alter the user agent. That's hilarious.
What are you talking about? You're talking about whatever
on the Apache log, yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm curious too. Who is doing that right now? Or did that before?
No, I think it's brilliant. Anyway, cool. Everyone, please have a wonderful and safe rest of their day and weekend, and stay in touch on the meetup or on the Slacks, and then until we meet again, everyone have a wonderful and safe weekend. So I will see you guys later.